They told me it was impossible. Impossible that they broke my laptop. Impossible that I could prove it. Impossible that a normal guy could ever win against a billion-dollar shipping giant. But a few months later, a senior finance director at UPS was standing in his own headquarters, furious, humiliated, and forced to pay from his personal bank account just to stop bailiffs from stripping the office bare. And it all started with one smashed MacBook and a promise I made to someone I loved. If you've ever been ignored, disrespected, or crushed by a massive corporation that thought you were too small to matter, you're going to feel this story. So hit like, subscribe, and settle in, because this isn't just petty revenge. This is grief-fueled, legally precise, karmic justice. Served ice cold. I didn't know, when I handed that box over to the UPS counter, that I was starting a war. At the time, it felt like such a small, ordinary moment. Just another errand on an already busy day. A brown cardboard box, reinforced at the corners, padded carefully inside with foam, bubble wrap, and layers of protection that bordered on obsessive. Inside it sat a nearly new MacBook, clean, flawless, working perfectly. I remember turning it on one last time before sealing the box, watching the familiar Apple logo bloom softly on the screen, feeling a strange mix of responsibility and affection. This wasn't just a laptop. This was a gift. It was going to my mother-in-law. And she meant more to me than most people ever get to mean to anyone. She wasn't just my wife's mom. She was my second mother. My confidant. My sounding board. The person who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. The kind of woman who listened when you spoke. Really listened, the way people don't anymore. When she asked me to help her by sending that laptop, I didn't hesitate for a second. Of course I would. I made sure everything was perfect. I paid extra for shipping. I insured it. I trusted UPS. Because they were UPS. Big. Professional. Global. The kind of company you're supposed to trust. That trust lasted exactly until the box arrived. The call came from her voice, but something was wrong. There was confusion in it. Hesitation. She told me the package had arrived. But the laptop inside, it was smashed. Not scratched. Not dented. Smashed. The screen shattered. The casing bent like it had been thrown, dropped, or crushed under something heavy. It didn't turn on. It didn't respond. It was dead. I remember sitting down slowly when she told me. Like my body instinctively needed support. My mind ran through possibilities. Maybe customs opened it badly. Maybe it was a freak accident. Maybe, somehow, it was my fault. But no. I knew how I'd packed it. I knew how carefully I'd sealed it. And deep down, I already knew what had happened. Someone, somewhere along the line, hadn't cared. Someone had treated it like it was just another box. Just another thing. Still, I stayed calm. Rational. Adult about it. I contacted UPS politely. I explained the situation. I gave them the tracking number. I told them the item was damaged in transit and asked about compensation. I wasn't angry yet, I wasn't demanding. I just wanted them to do the right thing. That was my first mistake. The tone shifted immediately. Suddenly, it wasn't their fault. It was my packaging. Or maybe the laptop was already broken. Or maybe it was impossible for their handling process to cause that kind of damage. Impossible. That word stuck with me. Impossible, as if gravity doesn't exist in warehouses. As if boxes never fall, never get thrown, never get stacked carelessly. They spoke to me like I was naive. Like I didn't understand how shipping works. Like I was trying to pull a fast one on a billion-dollar corporation. Weeks passed, not days. Weeks. Endless emails. Calls that went nowhere. Each time I spoke to someone new, I had to explain everything again from the beginning. Each time, they deflected. Blamed. Delayed. At one point, they even started threatening customs charges. Charges I wasn't liable for. Charges for an item that arrived destroyed and worthless. The audacity of it made my stomach twist. They weren't just refusing to help. They were actively trying to intimidate me into giving up. So I stopped asking nicely. I took the laptop to an Apple-authorized repair shop. I asked them to inspect it properly. I needed facts. Evidence. Something concrete. They didn't hesitate. The damage, they said, was consistent with being dropped or thrown. External force, not wear and tear. Not internal failure, impact damage. They put it in writing. I documented everything. Photos. Receipts. Emails. I even had proof that the MacBook worked perfectly when I sent it. I sent all of it to UPS, they didn't care. That's when something inside me changed, not rage. Not yet, something colder. Something steadier. The realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was policy. Delay long enough. Frustrate the customer. Make it so exhausting that they walk away, because most people do. Most people don't have the time, the energy, or the knowledge to fight back, but I did. I'd studied law at university. Not enough to call myself a lawyer, but enough to understand systems. Enough to know when someone was bluffing. Enough to know that this wasn't over unless I let it be over. So I filed a small claims case. That was when UPS finally took notice. And not in a good way. They hired a lawyer, a real one. I started receiving formal letters, heavy language. Threats dressed up as professionalism. They said they contested the claim. That if I lost, they'd pursue full costs. That this could get expensive for me. They wanted me scared. They wanted me to back down. I didn't. I prepared meticulously. I laid everything out, the packaging proof, the Apple report, the correspondence, the timeline. When the day came, I walked into that courtroom calm, focused, and quietly confident. UPS sent representation. Big company. Big attitude. But facts don't care about size. I won. Not just the claim. The costs. Extra compensation. Interest. The court ordered them to pay. And then, they didn't. They ignored it. Just like that. As if a court order was optional. As if the law only applied when it suited them. And while I was dealing with that silence, with that disrespect, life delivered a blow I never saw coming. My mother-in-law passed away. Suddenly. Unexpectedly. Before I could resolve the issue. Before I could tell her I'd fixed it. Before I could make good on the last thing she ever asked me to help her with. The grief hit like a physical weight. The kind that sits on your chest and makes breathing feel like work. I lost more than a relative. I lost my anchor. My mentor. My friend. And in the middle of that grief, there was one unresolved thread. One injustice still hanging in the air. UPS hadn't just broken a laptop. They had turned her last request to me into weeks of stress, harassment, and frustration. That wasn't just business anymore. That was personal. Taking down UPS was no longer about money. It was about respect. Memory. Justice. And I promised myself, quietly, that I would finish what I started. No matter what it took. Grief does strange things to time. Days blur. Nights stretch endlessly. After my mother-in-law passed away, everything slowed down, except my thoughts. They raced constantly, looping back to the same unfinished business. The smashed laptop. The ignored court order. The cold, corporate silence. It felt unfinished, like a door left half open in a storm. Every time I tried to focus on something else, my mind dragged me right back to it. The last thing she had asked me to do. The last promise I hadn't been able to keep. UPS didn't just fail to pay. They vanished. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls landed in automated mazes. When I finally reached a human being, I was passed around like a problem no one wanted to own. There was always a new excuse. We're reviewing the case. It's with another department. Someone will call you back. No one ever did. And with every delay, the message became clearer: they were waiting me out. Betting that grief, exhaustion, or life itself would distract me enough to let it go. What made it worse was the customs harassment. Even after being told the laptop arrived destroyed, they kept pressuring my mother-in-law before she died, demanding fees she didn't owe. And after she was gone, the paperwork kept coming. Cold, automated letters, as if nothing had changed. As if she was still alive to receive them. Holding those letters in my hands felt like being punched in the chest. This wasn't just incompetence anymore. It was cruelty by indifference. At first, I tried to handle it the right way. I reminded UPS about the court judgment. I attached copies. Highlighted deadlines. Explained, calmly, that they were now in violation of a legal order. I gave them time. More time than they deserved. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I still half believed that someone reasonable would step in and fix it. That surely, at some level, a company this big wouldn't just ignore a court. That belief died slowly. It died with every ignored email. With every generic response. With every day they acted like the law didn't apply to them. And in its place, something else formed. Something harder. I stopped asking myself how to get my money back. I started asking myself how to make them feel it. Not emotionally. Practically. Legally. Publicly, if necessary. I wanted consequences. Real ones. The kind you can't brush off with a template response. So I started researching. Late nights. Screens glowing in dark rooms. Tabs open everywhere. I read forums. Legal blogs. Case law. Enforcement procedures. I wasn't looking for shortcuts. I was looking for leverage. And slowly, piece by piece, I found it. They'd ignored a small claims judgment. That mattered. In the UK, that wasn't the end of the road. It was the beginning of a much bigger one. I could escalate it. Transfer it up. Turn a polite court order into something far more serious. Something that walked through doors instead of sitting in inboxes. High court enforcement. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't theoretical. People did this. Rarely against companies as big as UPS, but that was exactly why it worked. Big companies rely on systems. On volume. On the assumption that individuals won't push back hard enough to disrupt their routines. Enforcement officers didn't care how big you were. A writ was a writ. And the moment I realized that, I felt it. That quiet, dangerous calm. The kind you get when a decision has already been made. Even if you haven't admitted it to yourself yet. I thought about my mother-in-law. About her voice. Her patience. The way she trusted me when she asked for help. I thought about how stressed she'd been over those customs threats. How she didn't deserve even a second of that worry at the end of her life. And I knew then that this wasn't about playing nice anymore. I didn't care about the money. I cared about finishing it. So I took the judgment and transferred it to the High Court. I added the fees. The interest. Every pound UPS had forced me to spend chasing what they already owed. Each added cost felt justified. Not out of spite, but out of principle. If they were going to waste my time, they were going to pay for it. Then came the final decision: who would enforce it? Not all bailiffs are the same. Some knock politely. Some send letters and wait. I didn't want polite. I didn't want patient. I wanted relentless. I wanted professionals who understood pressure, procedure, and visibility. I wanted the kind of people who walked into boardrooms without flinching. So I hired the most aggressive high court enforcement firm in London. I knew UPS. I knew their culture now. Slow. Arrogant. Confident. That no one would actually show up. Confident they could ignore one more letter. One more warning. I trusted them to do exactly what they always did. Nothing. And that's what sealed it. Because when they ignored the enforcement notices, They didn't realize what they were actually ignoring wasn't me anymore. It was the law. Standing outside their front door, in heavy boots, with a clipboard and the authority to start taking things that weren't nailed down. I wasn't allowed to be there. I wasn't allowed to watch. No cameras for me. No dramatic confrontation where I stood in the background smiling. But that almost made it better. Because somewhere in London, at UPS headquarters, people were about to have a very bad day, and they had absolutely no idea it was coming. And as I waited for the call, for the report, for any sign of what was happening, I felt something I hadn't felt since before all of this started. Control. I wasn't there when it happened. And in a strange way, that made it even more powerful. Because while I was sitting miles away, checking my phone far too often, trying to act like this was just another day, the machine that UPS trusted so blindly was about to grind to a very uncomfortable halt. The bailiffs arrived in the morning. Business hours. Not late, not dramatic, not hidden. Broad daylight. The kind of timing that says, we're not sneaking around. We belong here. They didn't rush. They didn't swagger. They walked up to the front of UPS headquarters. Like men who had done this 1,000 times before and knew exactly how it always went. Clipboards in hand. Paperwork ready. Authority unquestionable. Inside that building, it was probably just another normal day. Emails. Coffee cups. Meetings scheduled back to back. People walking past glass walls without a second thought. Somewhere, someone was complaining about traffic. Somewhere else, a manager was already stressed about targets. No one was thinking about me. No one was thinking about a smashed laptop. No one was thinking about a court order they'd ignored. Until the reception desk called security. The bailiffs explained who they were. And why they were there. Calmly. Professionally. No raised voices. No threats. Just facts. A high court writ. A judgment debt. Outstanding balance. Immediate enforcement. The kind of language that doesn't invite debate. Security tried first. They always do. Firm voices. Hands hovering near radios. A quiet but clear attempt to reassert control. You can't be here. You need to leave. You'll have to make an appointment. The bailiffs didn't react. Didn't argue. They simply explained, again, that they were legally entitled to be there. That leaving wasn't an option. That ignoring them would make things worse. That was when the office manager got involved. According to the report, he arrived with purpose. Fast steps. Tight jaw. The body language of someone used to being obeyed. He tried a different tactic. Authority instead of force. Corporate confidence. The assumption that this was all a misunderstanding that could be brushed away with the right tone. He spoke down to them. Questioned their legitimacy. Suggested they were mistaken. The bailiffs listened. Patiently. And then they did what UPS had spent months refusing to do. They started working. They explained the process one last time. If payment wasn't made immediately, they would begin listing and seizing assets. Computers. Office equipment. Anything of value. Everything would be documented. Removed if necessary. Sold if it came to that. The costs would increase. Rapidly. Still, no payment. And that was the moment. The shift. The point of no return. The bailiffs began to list goods. Clipboards moved. Pens scratched. Desktop computers. Monitors. Furniture. Items that had never been thought of as vulnerable suddenly became liabilities. Security watched, unsure. The office manager's confidence cracked, just a little. He made calls. Quick ones. Urgent ones. People who had ignored emails suddenly mattered. From where I was, I imagined the atmosphere changing. The hum of normal work disrupted. Whispers spreading. Heads lifting from screens. The uncomfortable realization sinking in that something was very wrong. That this wasn't a drill. That this wasn't going away. Security tried again. Firmer this time. Voices raised. An attempt to physically usher the bailiffs toward the door. That was a mistake. High court enforcement doesn't respond well to being bullied. They reminded security, calmly but clearly, that interference could have legal consequences of its own. That they were acting under court authority. That touching them, obstructing them, or removing them would only escalate things further. And still, no payment. That's when the accounts manager arrived. The report described it perfectly, arrived in a hurry. You can picture it. The speed. The anxiety. Someone who understood numbers. Who understood risk. Who understood exactly how expensive this was about to become. He listened. Asked questions. Checked balances. Made calls of his own. But even then, nothing happened. The bailiffs called their office. Requested approval to begin removals. That sentence alone gives me chills. Because begin removals isn't a threat. It's a process. A forklift doesn't care about your brand. A bailiff doesn't care about your quarterly targets. Law doesn't care how big your logo is on the building outside. And that's when the real power walked into the room. The finance director. The report didn't describe him in emotional terms. But you don't need much imagination. This was someone who never expected to deal with something like this personally. Someone used to signing off numbers, not being confronted by consequences. He was, according to the report, not at all happy about the attendance. That's corporate understatement at its finest. He argued. Questioned. Pushed back. The frustration was palpable even on paper. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. This wasn't how individuals were supposed to behave. People like me were meant to give up long before this stage. This situation simply wasn't in the script. But reality doesn't care about scripts. The bailiffs explained the removal process again. Explained the costs. Explained what would happen next. Explained that once removal started, stopping them would become far more expensive, far more public, and far more embarrassing. And finally, the calculation changed. The finance director made a decision. Not as a company. Not through accounts payable. Not after another internal meeting. He agreed to pay in full. Immediately. Voluntarily. From his personal account. To stop them. When I read that line in the report, I had to read it twice. Then a third time. There it was. Black and white. The moment everything shifted. A multinational corporation brought to heel not by outrage or shouting, but by quiet, relentless enforcement. They didn't take the computers. They didn't touch the fancy plants or the furniture. They didn't have to. The damage had already been done. The illusion of untouchability was gone. And somewhere inside that glass-fronted building, a finance director sat with a story he'd never forget. A story about a smashed laptop, a court order ignored. And the day UPS learned that sometimes the smallest claims carry the heaviest consequences. When I got the report, I didn't celebrate. I didn't cheer. I just sat there for a long moment, breathing slowly. Feeling something settle inside my chest. It was over. Or at least. The hard part was. The payment didn't arrive with fanfare. No apology attached. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the months of denial, deflection, and quiet intimidation. It was just there. Numbers in an account. Cold. Final. Undeniable. And somehow, that made it feel even more real. After all the noise, all the stress, all the silence from their side, the conclusion came in the most brutally simple form possible. Proof. I stared at the screen longer than I expected to. Part of me had grown so used to resistance that closure felt unfamiliar. Like reaching for a step that isn't there. I refreshed the page once. Then again. The balance didn't change. It stayed. They couldn't take this back. They couldn't ignore it. For the first time since this whole thing began, UPS had no move left. What struck me most wasn't the amount. It was more than double what I'd originally asked for. Fees, interest, enforcement costs, all stacked neatly on top of a problem they could have solved in the very beginning with a single reasonable response. Realistically, by the time everything was done, I knew it had cost them at least 3 times the original claim. Maybe more. For a company of their size, it was nothing. A rounding error. And yet, it wasn't nothing at all. Because money wasn't the point anymore. The point was that they were forced to act. Not because they wanted to. Not because it was convenient. But because they had no other option. They had been dragged, step by step, through a process they assumed no individual would ever have the patience to complete. And in the end, someone at the very top had to personally intervene to make it stop. I couldn't stop thinking about that finance director. The moment he walked into that room. The shift in posture when he realized this wasn't a bluff. The calculation happening behind his eyes as he weighed embarrassment against escalation. I imagined the frustration, the anger, the disbelief that it had come to this. That an ignored court order had turned into bailiffs' cataloging office. Equipment in their own headquarters. And yes, I'll admit it. That image brought a quiet, guilty smile to my face. Not because I enjoyed humiliating anyone. But because for once, the power imbalance had reversed. Just for a moment. Just long enough to prove that size doesn't equal immunity. I thought about my mother-in-law then. About how she would have reacted if she'd known how far this went. She would have shaken her head, laughed softly, and told me I was stubborn. She always did. But I also know she would have been proud. Proud that I didn't let myself be dismissed. Proud that I finished what I promised her I'd do. That realization hit harder than I expected. I didn't feel triumph the way movies make you expect. There was no rush of adrenaline. No fist pump. What I felt was relief. Deep, bone-level relief. Like something heavy had finally been set down after being carried far too long. The kind of relief that lets your shoulders drop. Without you even realizing they were tense. For weeks after, I noticed the absence of stress more than anything else. No more checking emails with a knot in my stomach. No more bracing myself for another automated response. No more replaying arguments in my head, imagining what I'd say next. The fight was over. And in that silence, there was space to grieve properly. Space I hadn't allowed myself before. I realized something else too. If I'd given up early, if I'd accepted their initial dismissal, none of this would have happened. They would have won by default. And that knowledge sat with me. Not as a lesson in revenge, but as a reminder of how many people are quietly worn down by systems designed to exhaust them. UPS didn't change because of me. Their processes didn't magically improve. Somewhere else, someone is probably fighting the same battle right now. But for once, in one small corner of the system, the usual outcome didn't happen. And that mattered. Because this wasn't just about a broken laptop anymore. It was about refusing to be reduced to a ticket number. About insisting that promises mean something. That the law applies to everyone. Even companies that think they're too big to notice one person standing in front of them. Saying, no. You don't get to ignore this. When I finally closed my laptop that night, it wasn't out of frustration. It was out of completion. The kind you don't rush. The kind you sit with for a moment, breathing, letting it sink in. It was done. Time passed after that. Life moved forward the way it always does. Slowly filling the space left behind by things that once felt overwhelming. The emails stopped. The letters stopped. UPS faded back into what it should have always been to me. Just another logo on a delivery truck. But the experience didn't disappear. It stayed with me. Quietly reshaping how I see power, justice, and the stories we tell ourselves about what we're allowed to fight for. People often ask whether it was worth it. The time, the stress, the effort. Whether I'd do it again. And the honest answer is complicated. If this had only been about money, probably not. No amount of compensation truly balances months of frustration. But it was never just about money. It was about being dismissed. About being told, over and over, in subtle corporate language, that I didn't matter enough to deserve accountability. That's what companies like that rely on. Not intimidation in the obvious sense, but erosion. Delay long enough, complicate things just enough, and most people will walk away. Not because they're wrong, but because they're tired. Because life demands their attention elsewhere. Because fighting feels like shouting into the wind. And that's why this mattered. Because for once, the wind changed direction. I didn't beat UPS. Not really. They're still enormous. Still powerful. Still moving millions of parcels every day. But in that moment, on that issue, the system worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Not because of outrage or viral pressure, but because persistence met procedure. Because someone refused to disappear quietly. And I think about my mother-in-law often when I reflect on that. About the way she handled conflict. Calmly. Firmly. Without ego. She believed in doing things properly, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Finishing this wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of respect. For her. For myself. For the idea that fairness isn't something you beg. It's something you insist on. There's a particular satisfaction in knowing that no one at UPS could spin this internally as a misunderstanding. There was a paper trail. A judgment. A writ. Bailiffs in the lobby. A finance director pulling out his personal banking app to stop office assets being wheeled away. That story exists now, whether they like it or not. It's part of their institutional memory. A quiet reminder that ignoring people has consequences. And yes, I won't pretend I don't enjoy the image. The polished floors. The glass walls. The sudden tension as routine collapses. The realization that policies don't protect you when you ignore the law. There's something deeply human about that reversal. Not cruel. Just balanced. That's what karma actually looks like, I think. Not lightning bolts or dramatic speeches. Just systems doing what they're meant to do when someone finally follows through. If there's a lesson here, it isn't seek revenge. It's simpler than that. Don't let yourself be erased. Don't assume that being small means being powerless. Learn the rules. Use them. And don't confuse patience with surrender. Because sometimes, the most satisfying justice doesn't come from shouting the loudest. It comes from staying standing the longest. And somewhere out there, every time I see a UPS truck drive past, I don't feel anger anymore. Just a quiet certainty. That at least once, in one small but meaningful way, they were reminded that even giants have to answer when they break something that matters. If this story gave you that slow, satisfying chill, the kind that builds, instead of explodes, hit that like button and subscribe for more real, earned revenge stories like this. And tell me in the comments. Have you ever stood your ground when a powerful company thought you'd give up? Because sometimes, the best revenge is simply refusing to disappear.